Correct. Stacy's face was probably the best, but I figure with what Nick gets away with up here, I would be safe. So I grew up on this show. Like as a kid, like we're talking early mid 80s started. And so I was only like, I mean, if it started 86, 87, I'm 6, 7 years old. And I mean, I watched it. Sometimes it would even come on like twice in a day, and I knew like which channels to switch to. So for me, if you're familiar with the show, because I think anyone younger than 30s would like, what is this? Or even Stacy, she knew of it, wasn't allowed to watch it. Married with Children, not a wholesome show at all. I am not recommending you go out and watch it. Not at all. Let me be clear. Not at all am I recommending you go watch it. However, the popularity of the show, as long as it lasted, shows like it, and that what the precedent that it set, and it kept moving forward. This is the idea of family. The dad is an idiot. And he's just miserable. There's complete, total dysfunction, selfishness. It is in a lot of ways, it represented kind of the American family. I mean, there's many families operate that way. That was just sort of normal. And it just demonstrates the amount of the dysfunction, the problems. And I think as we've been going through Corinthians, the Corinthians themselves, they are dysfunctional as a church. We saw that kind of last week. Nick was preaching on the lawsuits and the issues. Then we had, or 2 weeks ago, then sexual immorality. And so followed up naturally, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul is continuing dealing with issues. There are so many things that he's got to set straight among the believers. And chapter 7 begins, really, it's the principles for marriage. And what does it mean to be married? What does it mean to have this family? And for us, our ministry is Families of Virtue, that the family is not just something to be endured. And that's kind of the way it was for me. Well, I'm going to talk to Stacy about it, that my whole childhood was spent, how can I get out of the house? How can I stay away because of problems, issues? I grew up kind of in that mind frame. And the family is the means by which the church is really going to be the church. And I was just thinking about this, and I really wanted to either do a sermon on it or incorporate it. I used to preach how if you went Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Sunday school, you were the super Christian, right? Because you get like every time the doors are open. That's actually the dabbler. That's not the super Christian. That's dabbling in Christianity. If the doors of the church are what define your Christianity, then you're dabbling. You're not really in Christianity. And our homes are going to be the place that should center around this. The home is where the purpose of a family, God literally in the Old Testament says he created families for the purpose of creating godly children. That's one of the purposes they serve. That's a function of the family. And so this is why, in terms of Christianity, the way we're supposed to live, the family should be that place that we could go to, and that even though it has broken people, it should be a family that still functions with the unity of Christ. Because he does that with churches. He takes churches full of wonderfully broken people, and we function as a body. We function as one under Christ, because he's the one who holds us together. So Paul, shifting to the concept of marriage, and I wanted to also share this. I came across this recently. So throw that picture up there, Justin. So this is, because my eyes are good, but not that good. This is Shulamith Firestone. Her major writings were in the 70s and 80s. This quote, it says, "The family structure is the source of psychological, economic, and political oppression." That's one of her big quotes. The family, it's just all bad. Some of her writings even advocated, this is again the 70s and 80s, she was trying to figure out a way to free women from children. Some way that women could have children without having to bear the oppressiveness of having their offspring. Like that was, and I bring this up because, again, this is 70s and 80s. I mean, I know we talk about this stuff today, but this is where it started. These were some of the movers and shakers. She was a major influence in second wave feminism, which, if you didn't know, there was first wave feminism, there's second wave, and there's third wave that we're in now. But there was just this massive movement to free from all constraints. And so when we look at the family today and we look at where we are in terms of what we think about families, between the lowbrow, things like Married with Children, and the highbrow writings of the scholars, is it any wonder that the family is disintegrating across our land? That it was fascinating for me, the Mother's Day I spent in South Africa when I went there in, was it 2019? So I went to South Africa, Mother's Day. They celebrate Mother's Day in South Africa, same time about we do. And I was in a church, larger church, so several hundred people there. And they said, mothers in the room, please stand. And mothers stood up. Grandmothers in the rooms, please stand. Grandmothers stand up. Great-grandmothers in the room, please stand up. And there's a lot of women that stood up. Now, in America, it's we're much more impressed. We're just like, hey, you got great-grandmothers, but for them, the families naturally started early, and there was much more of that family unity that was there. And our culture has, in many ways, shunned that. So for the Corinthians, they're asking some questions, and they're questions that we ask today. They're questions, how should we operate under these certain conditions? What do we do when things go bad? You can't unscramble eggs. What are we supposed to do? So reading, starting in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, we're going to go through verse 16 today, but the first section here, he says, "Now concerning the matters about which he wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by arrangement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." Now, in this first paragraph that starts, I'm sure you've heard lots of sermons on this passage because, and this is kind of what Nick has alluded to, that reading through some of these things, it's like, this seems oddly specific, like the kinds of things that are mentioned here. Well, Paul is literally doing Q&A. They've written to him, they said, here's some of our issues. So Paul's having to address it, and we look at this and we're like, just get along. And the problem is, even in our own lives, sometimes we wonder, given situations, given certain things, what are we supposed to do? What is pleasing to God? How should we operate? And if we don't operate correctly, we're in sin. And all sin is a corruption. And part of what we've dealt with is the corruption started at the beginning. God said, don't eat fruit, and then our ancestors ate the fruit. God said, worship me, we worship anything but God. God said, men and women. And then we put men and men, women and women, and 64 genders in California. That's the one thing I'm really interested in when I get to California. I want to see all these genders that they have because I'm like, there's only two. There's only two. I think it's 64 last time I checked. It might have hit triple digits by now. But this is the corruption we've brought into this. God said, marry and be fruitful and multiply. Simple enough command, but we tend to muddy the waters. And so Paul begins, he shifts when he says, now concerning these matters, this literally, after reading chapter 6, in his letter, it's almost like Paul just draws a big line and says, okay, new topic. Matters about which he wrote. And he quotes them. It's good for a man not to have relations with a woman. And what they're saying is, it go back to chastity. It goes back to the whole idea of purity. And like what Paul had just addressed, sexual immorality. It's good to be pure. It's good to not burn with lust and all these things. However, the context is that this is happening in marriage. That people are married and they're like, nope, no more. Like, who was it? Is it I Love Lucy? Husband, Desi? Is it Desi? Desi and Lucy? Okay. So they started out, when you watch the TV show, they're in separate beds. I think I got this right. I've never actually watched an episode, but I have heard about these things. I was too busy watching the Bundys. So when you have two beds, and then eventually, I guess like in a new season, all of a sudden they're down to one bed. Okay, and that was a bit scandalous, back in the 60s, 50s. Okay, I'm working on it. That's decades before my time. But when the looks of some people, I love it. So when this went on, there's this movement. We see this, and we understand that the marriage is supposed to, there's just some things that are natural to marriage. And so here they're saying, but no, we're going to be abstinent in marriage. And what's happening, what I noticed as I'm reading through this, every bit of this is corruption. It's taking a good thing and corrupting it. In this case, it's chastity. It's the concept of abstinence, which is good, but it's excessive. Because if you're married, you're not supposed to act like you're not married. That was one of the lessons I learned early for those that are looking one day to get married. One thing you do not do when you get married is act like you're not married. You do not continue as business as usual. Like for the men, you're no longer bachelors. Okay? You cannot act that way. Because I tried. Amen? I got the witness in the room. She knows. The first several years of marriage, absolutely horrible. My fault. Why? Because the Bundys were my mentors. That's why. I mean, I grew up like this is how people act, right? This is normal. And it might be normalized, but it's not good. And what Paul is saying, he's not disagreeing with them in the sense, yes, but in context, you're married. In context, there are obligations. And what's really radical with Paul is when he says, we look at this, that the wife doesn't have rights of her own body, which most of the people in that day, obviously, but then to say, well, the man doesn't have rights in his body either. That we miss. That's radical for this day. That for them to be, like what he's doing, he's connecting with what God established. They're one flesh. They should operate together. And he says, if you do decide to abstain, then he's like, that's perfectly fine. That's where, again, we won't call it fasting because we talked about that. But if we're going to abstain to focus and to focus on those spiritual things, he's like, fine. But it's very practical. Mark your calendar. Like, have these clear-cut lines, because what was happening, you can imagine, spouses are becoming really bitter with each other. They're like, what gives? What in the world? And both parties were not on board. He's like, get the act together. Move together, because chastity, purity, those things are good, but there's the concept of virtue. It's always the middle. It's always the mean between two extremes. And that's what we like to do. We like to take things like what we looked at last week was defective chastity. And that's where we're just kind of like, like, hey, what are you doing tonight? Or I do have a great clip too. Didn't show it. It was Woody Allen movie, and he's at an art gallery, and they're looking at Jackson Pollock, which, if you know what that is, that's the guy who just basically takes paint and flings it on the canvas and art. So they're looking at Jackson Pollock, and the Woody Allen goes up to the lady who's standing there, and he's like, what do you think? And she's like, I think it represents the darkness of mankind and the misery of the soul and the meaninglessness and purposelessness of life. And he's like, what are you doing Saturday night? She's like, I'm going to kill myself. It's like, oh, what are you doing Friday night? And she walks off. So, y'all can't see Justin. I killed him. So, that mindset, though, it's just one thing that's on some people's minds. That's the vice, that's the sin, that's the corruption. And so for those who wish to go to the other extreme, Paul's letting them know this is not good either. Like, don't knee-jerk. And I think what happens sometimes in our families, since we don't recognize or really know what is good, we end up falling into those corruptions. We become hyper on one side or defective on another. And our families suffer for it. Our families don't know how to operate. It goes back to even just among families, like when you have sweets and treats, in moderation. You eat too much, you go through that, and all of a sudden everybody's sick. It's bad. He's letting them know self-control is good, but in the context of the family, there's a certain way we're supposed to operate. So he continues on, verse 6. He says, now as a concession, not as a command, I say this. I wish that all were as myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of each kind and one of another. So what Paul's doing, he's like, this is a concession. He's like, I'm letting you know, because for the ones who are married, they're like, okay, we're married, we're good. So for all you single people, ha. And Paul's like, listen, I think what Paul is doing with this, he is recognizing if you tell somebody, so this is what happens with kids. You've experienced this with your kids and your grandkids. They say, hey, can I have a cookie? Sure, you can have a cookie. And you go and half the pack is gone. What did you do? You're like, I had cookies. It's like, no, you have a few. And they ate, but again, you said I could have cookies. I want a cookie. You gave me, I ate lots of cookies. Or, there's so many times with our boys that this has happened where they just kind of, they want to play with water in the sink. That's something my boys like to do. They like to clog up the sink and play with the water in the sink, okay? That's awesome. Until you go in, the entire bathroom's wet, there drenched, and it's like, what were you doing? Playing in the sink. Like, there's limits. We take the good thing and just go too far. So here, Paul is extolling the good that is within a marriage, but I think what he does, he has to also step back. He also says, listen, there's also good to being single. There's also good to being like I am. So it's not that one has so much of an advantage over the other. He says everyone's kind of called to what they're called to. Because in our society, there are those who say, you know what, I'm just never going to get married. I'm going to be celibate, dedicate myself to the Lord. If that's something God's called you to, that is a good thing. But if you're not called to that, that's a corruption. And you've set yourself up for failure because that's not your calling. And even inside the marriage, this is what's going on. They're like, hey, we're going to practice celibacy. I was like, we're married. And then you've got the single people, and they're like, well, I want to be like married people. It's like, well, that goes through the avenue of marriage. And for the people who are single, and I've had friends who've been single into their 30s. They said they just couldn't find someone, and I think sometimes we as the church, we treat them. It's like when they're 26, 27, hey, when are you going to get married? And we treat people like that. It's like, hey, you're not married. What really bugged me, too, was at the Bible college where I had people who were constantly like, hey, you're going to have another baby. And I would tell them, my reproductive processes are none of your businesses. Really, going up, there's so many, again, I was at the Bible college, so I liked my job. I didn't want to get fired. I had some really good answers to some things I could have said. I would have never been asked that question again, ever, by anyone who was in the room. But I was like, I got 3. What more you want me to do? Obviously 4. We want more. No, you're not the one who has to feed them and bathe them and take care of them. We have this mindset, oh, you don't have enough kids. And then what we do too with a person who has to buy the 15-passenger van to house all their kids, we're like, get a TV. Why do you have so many kids? There's these, we have this way of taking anything good and corrupting it and comparing that with the others. He's like, people have been called to what they've been called to, and we should celebrate that rather than corrupting. So in verse 8, he says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. He goes back to that concession. But if they cannot exercise self-control, and that's not, and this is not a slam on them. This is not saying, well, if you can't control yourself, because God has gifted us with, and the classic word that's used is appetites. It's used, the word appetite is used for anything we desire, whether it's entertainment, video games, or food. We have these appetites naturally. We have an appetite for community and fellowship and to be with people. And even in this aspect, he says if they cannot exercise self-control. In other words, if the appetites are very strong, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. It sets people up for failure. And so he's trying to lay these things out. Just he's shooting for the middle ground. He's like, look, if you're unmarried, if you're a widow, people say, what should I do? And it's really, what has God called you to? Your situation, where you are. Verse 10, to the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. And notice what he did there. He shifted. He's like, look, here's prudence. He really tells them, be prudent. Like, just use your brains as far as what you need to do. Verse 10, now this is from the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. Now this is a charge given unto the church. These are given to believers, because in verse 12, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. Okay. Now again, notice the shift. I and not the Lord. So it doesn't mean that you can ignore him, but there is that element. It's you got to use more of your brain in this situation. But what he suggests, what he says, if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Because, and this is why when Paul's dealing with this, Jesus never dealt with this kind of stuff because it was just in the context of believers. Paul has an audience that people are coming to faith and the spouse is not. And we see this happen a lot. What do we do? He's saying, look, if the spouse is cool with it, don't divorce. If any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So here he's saying there's actually a sanctifying effect of having a believer in the family. It changes the dynamic, and I know sometimes, especially if you're one of those who's been a part of a family and you feel like you're the only believer. You feel like you're the only one who even remotely cares about God. Everybody else is just kind of flippant. There is a sanctifying effect because you are the Jesus that they see. You are the one, and you are bringing into that family the true and the good and the beautiful that all come from God. And so Paul is saying, look, if they're okay, then stay with them. Verse 15, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? How do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So here, Paul is laid out again, really just trying to deal with a multitude of situations. And it's difficult, and a lot of times we don't preach this because people are, well, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me. But I bet there's people that you know. I bet there's times people have come to you and they've said, what should I do in this situation? Paul is putting all of this into perspective, not just simply trying to give you a rule book to follow, but what I maintain, what he's doing, he's taking God's original intent, the purpose of marriage, and it's just genuine prudence. It's just practical wisdom in how to live this out. And he's also at the same time he's showing them things like if you've got believers who are married, then the idea is that they should stay married. Well, see, those kinds of things, that requires fortitude. That's why we teach about the virtues, because sometimes being married is not easy. Amen? Amen. And the reason it's not easy is because of you. Amen? Amen. Let's be clear. Each one of us brings our sin into the situation. Each one of us has brought a disease into that one flesh that causes problems, that irritates, that annoys, and you have to work through that. And God has called us to work through those things, that it requires not just fortitude, but also the sense of justice. That whenever I officiate a wedding, and we have one coming up at the beginning of November, I'm always very clear that there's that sense of justice. You're making a covenant. You have an obligation to this other person. And that means that even when it's tough, even when it's difficult, you've got to be the kind of person who can get through that. and all the other virtues, humility, forgiveness, all of those things have to come into play. Otherwise, what happens, we end up doing stuff, and probably what Paul was dealing with and why he brings this up is because if you imagine you've got somebody who comes into the faith, they're a new Christian, and in this day, probably all they've really got is the Old Testament. 1 Corinthians is written only about 20 years after the resurrection. So the Gospels haven't even really been penned yet, okay? This is about as early as it gets. So they've got the Old Testament. They're reading it, and they come to this passage in the book of Ezra, and Ezra says, hey, all of you, Ezra comes back to the land. He's in captivity. He leads a group back, looks at the people in the land, and the people in the land had married foreign women. So he had Jews who married the unbelieving women in this case, because if the women had married, they were no longer in Jerusalem. They went to go be with their husbands. So he looks at these guys with all these women, and he says, no way. The law says you don't do this. He basically brings everybody who was married had to come, and they had to demonstrate that they were married like a Jewish union. If they weren't, Ezra literally had them divorce their wives and send the entire family, wives and kids, away because of the corruption of the land. But that was because of the Mosaic law. The law specifically forbade that. The law demanded it be done because the law exacts a very high price for purity. Paul is also very clear, we are not under the law. We are not under that situation. So for any believers who are reading that, what should we do? Let's put away. No. Paul is saying, don't do that. You're not under the law. We're in a different situation now. And this is something I believe I've seen among couples. They grab something from Scripture, they grab one idea, and they incorrectly apply it, or they apply it, or doesn't actually apply at all, and they use it anyway. Paul is trying to show us how to think through our families and our relationship. What does it mean? Because I've often maintained if the family is broken, the church, in a lot of ways, doesn't stand a chance. Like individual local churches, God's church will remain, but as a culture, when the family breaks down, what do we have? We fall back on complete selfishness. We fall back on all the vices. The family is a purifying effect. Those who are older who guide you. Those who stand beside you who can support you. And even those who are younger who can show you your sin through their observations of you. Oh, the sanctifying effect children have. When your children and your grandchildren will show you what your sin looks like by doing the things you do, talking the way you talk, putting their hands on their hips the way you put your hands on your hips. Some of you are thinking, does he put his hands on his hips? No. But when they tell the kinds of jokes that you tell, when they talk to your spouse the way that you talk to your spouse, there's a huge sanctifying effect where all of a sudden you realize, I am not as good as I thought I was. Paul addresses this issue of the family because we need our families. It's not something that's additional. Our families are not something that just is to be endured so we can get out of the house. That was the case with the Shulamith Fireside, whatever her name was. She was one of those emancipated, and literally she talks about in her memoirs, she cut all blood ties completely, totally separated herself from her family. I don't know if you could see the rest of the message that was on there, but when she died in a New York apartment, and the only reason they knew she had died is because the neighbors were complaining of the smell. She'd been dead for a week. No one knew. She cut all ties, and what happens is we see she died alone. And there's part of me, there's great compassion for people like this because that's a miserable existence. God has given us a blessing of spouses and kids and families that even when they get on our nerves, remember that's the corruption coming through. And we should be that sanctifying force. If you're unhappy with your family, be the sanctifying presence. Well, they don't listen. Well, of course they don't. Their vices carry them away. That's why when Paul's talking to this group, if they were not willing to change, if they were not willing to work on this, none of this will matter. Because I think what you and I can agree on is that when we really want to do something and we're not interested in following rules, we don't follow the rules. Amen? That when we really want to do our own thing, we do our own thing, right? I watch my kids do that. I do that. My wife asks me sometimes, why did you do this thing? Because I did not want to do that thing. She's like, but this other thing is good. I'm fully aware of that. I did not want that thing. I want this thing. So I did this thing. She's like, but that's bad. Yes, it is bad. I'm not disagreeing. I have sin. I'm very honest about it. I just recognize that sometimes I want the sinful things. My appetites mean more than what is good. We have to want what's good more. And the thing is, the strangest thing, and I'll finish with this. When Stacy and I were first dating, the weirdest thing I found was their family was always eating together. It annoyed me. Why are we always having to eat together? Every Sunday they would eat, we'd hang out, she's having to eat. Every single night she's eating like her meal with her family. Like, why is she doing this? Again, I grew up sitting on the living room, eating in front of the TV. Only time we ever ate meals were Thanksgiving and Christmas, like when family got together, and then it was just to watch what happens because the family's together. Better than TV at that point. And I just didn't get it. And it just, again, and Stacy can verify this, like I was confused. I knew no better in this sense. I thought I knew a better way. And what happens is eventually, over time and decades, I start to see the value, and I've now realigned my appetites. I desire time with the family. I want to be around. That the whole idea of leaving for the month and traveling that we're looking to do, and it bothers me because I'm going to be away from the core of my family. That used to not be the case at all. Paul is telling us this family thing, this is good. And so what I encourage you to do, look back at your marriages, look back with your children, or just kind of look around to where you are in your relationships now. Because again, we're all over the place in where we are in relationships and families. So this is why teens, you don't get out of this. That you have to look around because these habits you have now that sometimes when you're dating, the other will be like, haha, that's cute. That's sometimes will end up being grounds for divorce later on. They won't be able to put up with that. Because it's just like when kids, when they talk back, when they do that, we're like, okay, that's pretty funny, until it happens again and again and again and again. Take a look right now, because it's not looking out to the others. What you do is you look in here. You look to yourself. Because what Paul is telling them, when he gives them these charges, when he lays this out, if their heart was not willing, they're not going to do it. And the same is true with us. If we are not willing, if we are perfectly happy dabbling in Christianity and pretty much doing whatever we want to do, then we're going to do that. I know that. Are you done dabbling, or are you serious? Because I think for me, when I got married, I dabbled in marriage. I was just like, kind of tried this thing, and conflict ensued. And she just wouldn't leave. God bless her. I didn't try to run her off, but it was just like why she stayed, I'm not really sure. I was such an uncivilized, feral child growing up. And she became that sanctifying force in me. She showed me what it was like to be a human being. And what happened was I wanted that more than what I had always known. Didn't quite know how to get there, but she showed me. So the question is, have you identified that good? Do you have your eyes on Christ? It was Augustine who told us all vices are simply disordered loves. Do you have the love in your heart ordered properly towards what is good and what is godly, so that your family may come to match? Or is there some disorder you need to get straight today? Because if we're going to be the church God has called us to be, and I'm not meaning Church Universal, I mean right here in these walls. If we're going to be that church, we have to properly order those loves, or else we're going to continue that same process. And just like the sitcom, season after season, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And many of you know what this is like. Or are we willing to change the channel in our lives and get where God would have us be? Pray with me. Father, we thank you for this time as we look to your word, as we are reminded what you started so long ago, that when the world was still pure, when no corruption was in the land, you established the family. You gave Adam a wife specifically made for him. Lord, I can't imagine what the next years would have been like outside the garden. Families have been struggling ever since. We struggle because of that first sin. Lord, cleanse our hearts, realign us, that we would hunger and thirst